Hello, welcome to today's program, which is a Descendants presentation whereby we have invited a descendant of a member of the United States Colored Troops to share their soldier story. My name is Dawn Chitty. I'm the Director of Education at the African American Civil War Museum, and I'm joined by my colleague, Edwin Gasway, the Operations Manager. Our guest today is Audrey Hinton, who happens to be the chair of the Board of Directors at the museum. She will share the intriguing story about the slave culture that helped shape her ancestors' choices of surnames and a look at the documents she researched. This presentation will be of interest to those who wish to know more about surname selection by formerly enslaved people, the United States Colored Troops, Civil War, slavery, and the wealth of information available for family historians in pension and military files. Audrey Hinton is a native Washingtonian. After graduation from Roosevelt High School, she received her Bachelor of Arts degree from Northwestern University and a master's degree in city planning from MIT. She worked briefly as a city planner for DC's Redevelopment Land Agency and as a multifamily mortgage underwriter for James W. Rouse and Company. Audrey retired in 2014 from the Department of Housing and Urban Development, where she held managerial positions as a multifamily housing policy specialist. Audrey enjoys collecting art by African-American artists, tracing her roots, reading, exercising, and cooking vegan meals. She serves the community as chair of the board of directors of the African American Civil War Museum located in Washington, D.C., as a member of the Education and Scholarship Task Force of the Northwest Neighborhood Assembly, and as a tutor at Amadon Bowen Elementary School. She is married to Robert Richardson, a retired attorney. I'm going to turn it over to Ms. Hinton to present. However, I ask if you have any questions to place them in the chat box, and we will grab them from there at the end of her presentation. Also, if you could please place your mics on mute, that would make everything seamless and won't distract Ms. Hinton from her presentation. If you miss any of the portions of her presentation, don't worry, this is being recorded.
Great. Thank you, Dawn. Thank you for that introduction, and hello, everybody. Thank you for being here. So nice to see so many people. I see friends and relatives and club members. So nice to see you all. Such a beautiful day here in Washington. So thankful that you are willing to take an hour away from being out there enjoying this day. What I would like to do, first of all, let's try to share my screen with you. Can't do anything before I do that. Okay. One more second. Okay, very good. I'd like to start out by giving you an overview of what I'm going to talk about. I'm going to show and tell you how I learned the origin of my last name. I'm going to discuss surnaming patterns among the enslaved and the formerly enslaved. And I'm going to show you copies of the documents that I researched. When I'm finished, you might not agree with my conclusions, and some people find them a little bit controversial, but at least I hope you will have learned a lot about how formerly enslaved people selected their surnames, a few facts about the Civil War and slavery in Kentucky, and what a treasure trove of information one can find in the military and pension files, especially for family historians. So I'll start by saying that when I was growing up, my father, who's pictured right there, told me several times that my last name wasn't really Hinton. He told me, your real name is Garrett. And when my father and his two sisters were growing up, their father, my grandfather, who's sitting in that picture, told them the same thing, that their last name wasn't really Hinton, that their real name was Garrett. Now, none of this made any sense to me or to my father or my grandfather or my aunts. It didn't make any sense to any of our family members. And nobody could explain how in the world this could be. It was a mystery. And it remained a mystery until one day in January 1999, when I was at the National Archives tracing my roots. I can tell you now that I found the answer to this mystery in the surnames that my great-grandfather and his four brothers selected after they were discharged after serving in the 12th Heavy Artillery Regiment of the United States Colored Troops during the Civil War. Now, my ancestors weren't the only people who had to select a surname. All formerly enslaved people had to do that. And why was that? Well, first of all, enslaved people did not have last names. Some may have used one, but it wasn't legal for them to do so. And secondly, after emancipation, formerly enslaved people had many dealings in the world where they had to enter their names into public records. For example, they may have opened an account at the Freedman Savings Bank. So my great-grandfather and his brother did that. They may have signed labor contracts with the Freedmen's Bureau or entered into some sort of assistance. May have entered school. They would have needed a first name and a last name, or to record a marriage. Just some examples. I know, so some of you are probably saying, so what's the big deal about formerly enslaved people choosing a surname? After emancipation, didn't they just take the name of their last owners? Well, yes and no. Some did, some didn't. My ancestors were no different. So let me tell you a little bit about my research. I started tracing my roots back in January of 1999. I needed a project to work on, something to do. I'm one of these people, I always need a project, basically, some kind of research, always doing something. So my sister and my father suggested that I trace our roots. So I did. Daddy gave me a big old yellow sheet, legal sheet of paper with people's names and a few facts about them to get me started. But when I did start tracing my roots, this thing about what my last name really is wasn't on my mind. It didn't even cross my mind, but very soon it would. So one day I was at work surfing the net and I ran across a website about African-American soldiers. It was the Civil War Soldiers and Sailors System. That's a database containing information about the men who served in the Civil War in the Union and Confederate armies. Here's a picture of a page right there. Now, as far as I knew, Frank had not served in the Civil War. There was never any mention of it in my family, but it didn't hurt me to look at this website because maybe he had. I had nothing to lose by looking, and much to my surprise, Frank Hinton was listed. And here's that page, and you see number 17, it says Frank Hinton, Union Artillery 12th Regiment. So what I had to do next was go to the National Archives to see what more I could find out. I got there and I asked the staff for some help, and they told me that I could verify the information I found on the website by going to this index to compile service records of volunteer Union soldiers who served with the United States Colored Troops. And I went there, and this is the slide I found. It was the index card for Frank Hinton. So now I knew for sure that this Frank Hinton was the member of the 12th Heavy Artillery Regiment, as it said on the website, but I still didn't know whether he was my great-grandfather. So I was told by archive staff that I needed to look in the compiled military service records. So I went there and I was on microfilm. This was back in 1999 before we had stuff on the internet. So I was actually looking at microfilm. And I found this card for Frank Hinton. It was a muster and descriptive roll sheet. And it was really very interesting. Look at all of that information that's on there about Frank Hinton. It says that he was 21 years old. He enlisted September 2nd, 1864 in Lexington for 3 years. He had black eyes, black hair, black complexion, 5 feet 7 inches tall. And lo and behold, look there at the bottom. It says who his owner was, Thomas Hinton. But even with all of this information, I still didn't know for sure whether this Frank Hinton was my great-grandfather. But his age of 21 was in conformance with the information my father had given me, and he was born in Kentucky. So there was still a strong possibility that he was my great-grandfather. So next on this microfilm, I scrolled to the right and I scrolled to the left, and guess what? There were 4 other men whose last names were Hinton. There were Alexander, Robert, William, and Robert, Alexander, William, and Henry, yes. And just like Frank, all of them listed on the same day. And more than that, they all had the same owner. So I was finding all this interesting. It was looking like these fellows may have all been brothers. But I was told I had to go to the military records and still find even more information. But before I tell you what I learned in those papers, I've got to give you a little bit of background information. It deals with the Emancipation Proclamation. During the summer of 1862, President Lincoln, worried about having enough manpower for combat and logistical duties for the Civil War. He realized that the solution was to link emancipation with arming formerly enslaved men. So this led to his issuance of the Emancipation Proclamation, saying it was a military necessity, absolutely essential for the salvation of the Union. He realized that in order to preserve the Union, he would have to let enslaved men enlist in the war. But on the other hand, he didn't want to anger enslavers in the border states of Missouri, Maryland, and Kentucky. These were the slave states that had remained loyal to the Union. So what Abraham Lincoln did was he promised loyal owners in those border states that they would receive $300 in compensation for the service of their enslaved men in the war. 1 second. Well, in 1866, that's after the war, Thomas Hinton applied for the $1,500 in compensation that he was due for the service of the 5 men he had enslaved. But to get the money, he had to prove that he had valid title to each of them before they enlisted in the war. So he proved this by signing this document called the Claim for Compensation. And this is what Thomas Hinton said. It's there in his handwriting, but I will read it to you. He said of Frank Hinton, he said, "He is the son of a slave woman named Pernilla, who was my property at the birth of said Frank, and said Frank continued my property from his birth up to the date of said enlistment." And Thomas Hinton made the same statement about the 4 other men, the 4 brothers, in his claims for compensation. He said that he had owned them since their birth to a woman that he owned named Pernilla. So that certainly sealed for me the fact that these 5 men were brothers. So this is a little recap of the things I found in the compiled service records. I found that this man named Frank had 4 brothers, that all of them had served in the Civil War, that their owner's name was Thomas Hinton, spelled Henton, and that he lived in Woodford County, Kentucky. I learned that their mother's name was Pernilla, and that Frank and his brothers had the surname Hinton. But I still had no way of knowing whether this Frank Hinton was my great-grandfather, but I decided to assume that he was, unless I found information that proved he wasn't. Next, I had to go to the pension files. Staff at the National Archives advised me that my next step would be to check and see whether Frank and his brothers applied for disability benefits and whether their wives and children received any pension benefits as their survivors. So as you can imagine, as these brothers got older, the hardships that they encountered as formerly enslaved men and war veterans began to take a toll on their health and their ability to support themselves. Well, they needed money, but there were a lot of steps that they had to go through, any applicant had to go through to get a pension. 2 of the biggest were, the men had to prove that they were the person they said they were and the same person who had been in the Civil War. And women had to prove that they were indeed the widow of the deceased soldier. Now, this wasn't easy for many people. It wasn't even easy for white people, much less for formerly enslaved people. For the most part, formerly enslaved people had no birth records. They didn't have marriage records or contracts. They didn't have photographs. They didn't have any material evidence with which to prove their identity. Yet, in order to gain a pension, a person was required to present sufficient hard evidence to prove that they were who they said they were. So just think about it. If you didn't have a documented surname while you were enslaved, how would you prove your identity in a society where a surname is the key to determining who you are? And how could a widow prove her marriage to a deceased soldier when her marriage while she was enslaved wasn't legal and there was no material evidence of such a marriage certificate? So what did people do? How did they prove their identity? Well, they depended on the testimony of friends, neighbors, fellow soldiers who served in the same company, relatives, and others who were able to answer questions about their family relationships, employment, economic circumstances, previous ownership, and other issues related to the pension process. So what I did, next I had to go to the general index to the pension funds. And I readily found this card for Frank Hinton. You'll see that he applied for a pension on July the 28th, 1890. Civil War pensions first became available in 1862, but in 1890, a new law broadened eligibility for pensions and made them more readily available for Civil War veterans and their survivors. So next I located the cards for the brothers, and that was pretty easy, but it was a big surprise for me. Look at this card for Robert Hinton. It says, Robert Hinton alias Daniel R. Garrett. Now this was quite a shock for me. This was the first time in all of my research that I saw the name Garrett. I mean, it really took my breath away. And the first thing, of course, that came to my mind was, your real name is Garrett. I had no idea what this could mean. So the cards for the other three brothers, there's Alexander. You see Garrett on his card, Henry, and William also. But I've got to admit, I didn't know what the word alias meant. I just wondered if they had broken the law and assumed a new name, and here were both names on the cards. So I said, well, maybe the pension files will explain to me what all this is, and surely they did. But let me tell you, first of all, in reading these pension files, reading them was a very, very emotional experience for me. It was like I was connecting with these brothers, these ancestors of mine on some kind of a spiritual level. Here were these original files, looking not quite as bad as these, but still yellowing and a little crinkly, dated back then in 1999, almost 100 years earlier. They probably hadn't been touched by anybody since they were put in these files. The files brought the brothers to life for me because they contained so much information about them. And it was also in these files that there was enough information to confirm that Frank was indeed my great-grandfather. So this is the information that was in the files. There was sworn testimony from people helping Frank and his brothers prove they were who they said they were, and that they were the same men who had served in the war. There was testimony from people helping the widows of Frank's brothers prove that they had been married to the soldiers. There was also medical reports, funeral and burial records, statements of service, correspondence, and family and vital records useful for genealogy research. And as I said a minute ago, it was especially those records that helped me prove that Frank was my great-grandfather. So proving the identity took a little work, not so much for Frank. His file was pretty thin because he served in the war under the name Hinton, and he was filing for a pension under the name Hinton. But it was more difficult for his brothers. They had served in the Civil War under the name Hinton, but they were now claiming benefits under the name Garrett. And Robert had it doubly difficult because he had served in the war under his middle name, which was Robert, but he was now filing under his first name, which was Daniel. So let me tell you how that happened. There were rules for enlistment in the service. When they joined, military procedures required that they enlist under their master's name, which, as I told you earlier, was Hinton. That's because it was easy for the government to keep track of soldiers during the war so that their owners could receive their compensation. Now, Frank and his brothers objected to being enlisted under their master's name. They objected and they spoke up and they told the enlistment officer they wanted to be enlisted under their father's name, but it was all to no avail. In fact, Frank's brother William was asked during a deposition why he and his brothers enlisted as Hinton if they had been known as Garrett. And this is what William said. On the left-hand side, you'll see the handwritten answer to the question. The enlistment officer hand wrote everything that William said. You know, it's kind of a dictation, and it's kind of hard for you to read, so I'll read it to you. William said, "Well, sir, I remember quite well how that happened. When we first gave our names for enlistment, we gave our name as Garrett. Afterward, we were lined up, a number of us, and asked what were our owners' names. We told them, and I asked what they wanted that for, and the man, I don't know now who he was, the recruiting officer or somebody, told me that it might be our masters would be entitled to pay for us, and that it would be easier to keep track of us in our master's name than in our own. We didn't want it to go on the books that way, but they enrolled us in our master's names. And so my brothers and I came to be known in the service as Hinton." Now, here were some words uttered almost 115 years ago. They began to unlock the mystery for me of what my father meant when he told me, "Your real name is Garrett." Though the reason had been lost to history, my grandfather and my father knew that the name Garrett had been in the family at some point, but they hadn't been able to say when or why or what had happened to it. So where did the name Garrett come from? Okay. Well, I found the answer to that in the pension files too. In the deposition given by William on behalf of the widow of Daniel, and he said, "Before the war, we were known as Garrett, which was our father's name." And Frank said, when he was asked the same question, "Brother Robert and Brother Will both kept to the Garrett name, but I dropped the Garrett name altogether and returned to my Army name of Hinton. And I married as Frank Hinton and raised my family as Frank Hinton and draw a pension as Hinton. I don't claim the Garrett name at all now, though Henry Garrett was my father." So Garrett was their father's name, Henry Garrett. And this, by the way, is the only time in my 22 years of research, the only time and the only place too, that I've ever seen the name of the brother's father, Henry Garrett. But I was still puzzled. My great-grandfather and his brothers had been known as the Garrett brothers while they were enslaved. Their father's name was Garrett. Frank's 4 brothers resumed using the surname Garrett after the war. So why in the world did Frank keep the name Hinton? Can you guess where I found the answer? Yeah, you're right. I found it in the pension files. This is what Frank said. Frank said, "When we went to enlist, we all gave our name as Garrett from Hinton's, and they enrolled us as Hinton, and all the boys took their correct name of Garrett after discharge. But I thought best to stick to the Hinton name that I had established as a soldier." I thought best to stick to the Hinton name that I had established as a soldier. So I was wondering, what in the world did he do that he thought was enough to make him stick to the Hinton name? It must have been something that he was very proud of. So I was wondering, and I think I found it. He was promoted to corporal. Look at there. He was promoted to corporal August 14th, 1865, which was 12 months after he enlisted on September the 2nd, 1864. So I think he must have been very proud of this. So one day I asked my husband, Robert, who was in the Army, served in Vietnam. I said, Robert, what does a soldier have to do to be promoted to corporal? And Robert said, breathe. Like, that's all he had to do was breathe. So he just really cracked me up. I laughed for quite a while, but at any rate, I'm sure he had to do more than just breathe. His brothers were not promoted to corporal, and everybody was not promoted to corporal. So I think that Frank was very proud of that, and that was one of the reasons that may have helped him decide to keep the name Hinton. So when did these guys change their names? Was it shortly after the war, like Frank implied in one of his responses? Well, I really can't say, but here in 1870, we see Alexander Garrett. In the 1870 census, by the way, was the first census after the Civil War where formerly enslaved people were listed by their names. So here's Alexander living with his wife and 2 children, his daughter and a grandson. And you see he's using the name Garrett. It says Alexander Garrett, and there are his family members. Also, the 1870 census shows Henry using the name Garrett, and I should have put both pages here, but he's down here with a wife and several of his children. But as for William and Robert Daniel, which name he was using Robert here, they are still at home with mom, 1870. See Robert and William and 2 children here. Their mother was enumerated using the last name Hinton, and the enumerator shows that Robert and William had the name Hinton also. So that's probably what the enumerator was told. We assume here that their last name was Hinton, but they may very well have been using the last name Garrett, but it wasn't picked up during the enumeration. We don't know, but anyhow, that's why I looked at this to see when people changed their names. So just another little recap where we are here. So my great-grandfather and his brothers were known by the name Garrett, which was their father's name up until being enlisted in the war. During the Civil War, in accordance with military regulations, they were known by the name Hinton, which was their owner's name. And after the war, my great-grandfather Frank's 4 brothers resumed using the name Garrett, but Frank kept the name Hinton. So let's take a look at surnaming patterns, about the patterns that enslaved people took as well as formerly enslaved people. I've read the works of several scholars who've written on the subject. They researched Freedmen's Bureau records, pension files, military records, court records, plantation business records, wills, diaries, and other documents. And these are the things that they all agree on. This one point they make. They say that emancipated people did not always follow free society's practice of taking the father's surname, nor did they always take the surname of the last owner. They had their own naming patterns, which were very fluid. Here are some of those patterns. Owners generally kept track of enslaved people by their first names only. For the most part, they were known by the name of whoever owned them. For example, Frank would have been known as Thomas Hinton's Frank. In some states, slaves weren't allowed to use a surname because it was considered an honor that was due only to the master. In some states, it was actually against the law, a crime for an enslaved person to use a surname. Now, more often than many white people realized, their enslaved people had a surname, but they kept it as a secret. But if the enslaver found out that they had a surname, the enslaver was often surprised to find out that it was not their surname. It came as quite a surprise to them. As I mentioned earlier, after enslaved people were freed, they were quick and eager to select a surname. Well, first of all, for very practical reasons. Like I said, they may have had to sign contracts or enter school or any other number of reasons why they needed a first name and a last name. They did it because it was an important step in demonstrating their freedom and gaining the self-respect, dignity, and independence they didn't have while enslaved. And others did it to feel more secure. Some formerly enslaved men and women who had been using a surname during slavery didn't feel secure until they had changed their name. They felt that if whites changed their minds about freedom, they would be more difficult to find and re-enslave them if they had changed their names. I thought that was interesting. So here are some sources of names. We know that many chose names that represented freedom, like Freeman and Friedman. They chose names of prominent whites or national leaders like Lincoln, Washington, and Grant. They selected names that described their occupational skills, such as blacksmith, cook, carpenter, a color, black or brown, a place name, Paris being one of them. Gotta admit, I don't know anyone last name Paris. Well, they also chose surnames that reflected kinship ties, such as the mother's name, their father's last name, an earlier owner's last name, a grandparent's previous owner, and as we've already talked about, of course, the last name of their owner. So I mentioned how I'd read the works of many scholars. Herbert G. Gutman, who wrote a book called The Black Family in Slavery and Freedom, 1750 to 1925, devoted a whole chapter of 27 pages to the results of his research on slaves' surnames. He found that between 1864 and 1866, this was the time of emancipation, the majority of enslaved people, when freed, assumed a surname other than that of their last owners. He also found that by taking a surname other than the last owners, they were able to define themselves in a way that separated them from their owner and freed them symbolically of their servitude. Leon Liftwak, who's an American historian and the author of Been Down So Long, The Aftermath of Slavery, found that many newly freed people did adopt their master's last name, and that those who kept or adopted their master's surname did so not so much out of affection because of friendship ties. It could have been that the person's parents or grandparents had the master's last name, and that this alone was enough for them to keep the master's name. I also like this blog by Robin Smith. She lives here in Prince George's County, not far from DC. She has a blog called Reclaiming Kin. In an article, The Complexity of Slave Names, she said it was most common, excuse me. Ooh, let me take some water, hold on a second. Thank you. She said it was most common for free people to use the surname of either their mother or their father if they knew what those names were. So she asked for us to consider this. She says, think about how the surnames free people selected were connected to their experiences in slavery. She said an enslaved child sold away from their parents at a young age to the Deep South would probably have a different sense of naming than an enslaved child who was able to grow up in the presence of their parents or extended family. So what I want to leave you with on this subject is that there was no set pattern on how formerly enslaved people selected their surnames. Some used their master's name, others didn't. Still, whatever name they chose, it was not done haphazardly or without thought. And my ancestors fall right into the pattern. My great-grandfather's four brothers selected their father's name, which was Garrett. Just like people in the Free Society, they carried the surname of their father. They had strong ties to their father, most likely, or possibly to his family. Now, Frank, my great-grandfather, kept the name Hinton. He gave a lot of thought to it. And remember, he said, I thought best to stick to the Hinton name that I had established as a soldier. But I wonder if there might have been other influences on Frank's choice of surname. I've been wondering, like, what else, if anything, may have gone into his decision to keep the name Hinton. You'll remember I showed you the 1870 census, and we saw that his mother had the name Hinton. Could he have kept his name as Hinton to symbolize his tie to her? But sometimes I wonder if maybe there was an even bigger influence on this choice of surname. And that is, could he have felt a certain closeness to the family that owned him? Now, you know, a lot of people say, how could an enslaved person have felt some kind of closeness to the family that owned him? Well, D. Palmer Woodtour, the author of Finding a Place Called Home, a guide to African-American genealogy and historical identity, found that small-scale enslavers often had relatively close relationships with their enslaved. Let's look at Thomas Hinton. He was a small-scale enslaver. In 1850, this is the slave schedule, he had enslaved 13 people. And in 1850, he had 14. And in 1860, he enslaved 13. Now, these were average numbers for Kentucky farmers, but numbers were also a whole lot smaller than the hundreds of enslaved people found on plantations in the Deep South. So with so few enslaved people, I wonder if it might not have been possible for Thomas Hinton to have had a relatively, at any rate, close relationship with Frank. And there were 2 depositions in the pension files that further support my thoughts about a close relationship. These were depositions given by Anne Wright, who was Thomas Hinton's daughter. She gave this deposition on behalf of one of the widows who was filing for a widow's pension. You'll see in the deposition on the left, she said, these were known as Garrett's before the war. Now you'll remember that I told you that only a few owners knew that their enslaved had surnames. And if they did, they thought they had the owner's name. Well, here Anne Wright indicates she not only knew that Frank and his brothers had a surname, but she knew what their name was. She also said, I don't think I've seen any of them since the war, excepting Frank. He is a Methodist preacher and came here to conference once, and I saw him. Well, they may have just run into each other on the street, but I envisioned Frank paying her a visit, an act that wouldn't have been out of the question, you know, for him to have gone by to visit her. Well, after all, you have to remember he was born on that plantation and he grew up there. So he could very well have gone back to see Anne Wright. And on the right, you see another portion of the deposition where she said, I think I did see some of the boys after the war when I would go and see their mother, and some of them were living with her, but which I cannot say. This is true and correct. And you'll recall the 1870 census where the mother was living with William and Daniel. Well, she may have gone there. But another indication I have of the closeness Frank may have had with his family, with the family that enslaved him, comes from some oral history in my family. Frank's granddaughter, my cousin Vera, who by the way died in just 2 years ago, and she was 100 years old. My cousin Vera told me that she heard that Frank was his master's favorite. She said that Thomas Hinton taught Frank how to read and used him as a house servant as well as a field hand. She also told me that Thomas Hinton allowed Frank to drive the buggy, which was to her another possible indicator of Frank's favorite status. So when I first heard that, I imagined Frank taking the buggy on a Sunday afternoon to go visit Amanda, his future wife. But you know, I soon came to my senses about that. I thought very seriously that he could do that. But since driving the buggy was passed down in my family as an indication of Frank's favorite status with his master, I think Frank may have felt a certain sense of pride a sense of being special, and yes, possibly a sense of closeness to Thomas Hinton. And with that closeness, it could possibly have been a factor, among others, I admit, that helped Frank decide to keep the name Hinton. So in closing, I asked just, what is my real name? Is it Garrett, like my father said, and like my grandfather told my father? Well, with all due respect to my grandfather and my father, I say it is not. We all are carrying the surname that our ancestor Frank gave us. You know, when you have the opportunity to choose your name, as Frank did, you give it a lot of thought. You got to remember that Frank said, and I'll say it again, Frank said, I thought best to stick to the Hinton name that I had established as a soldier. To me, your name expresses who you are. It expresses your nature. It's your identity. It describes you and holds a lot of history, as the name Hinton certainly did for Frank. And all indications are that my great-grandfather was well aware of that, well aware of what he was doing when he selected his surname. And I think he selected his surname and that of all of his descendants very wisely. Thank you very much. There you go.
Thank you, Audrey. This is wonderful. I do have a few questions for you. First and foremost, I want to know what happened to Frank after the war.
Oh, okay, good question. Well, if the documents are correct, he got married before the war to Amanda Thomas, and I can show you a picture of her maybe later on. She was of Native American, African, and European descent. She appears, you can see the Native American in her very clearly. They got married, had 11 children, my great-grandfather being the youngest of those 11 children. He was an itinerant minister for the Methodist Episcopal Church, and you see him traveling around Indiana, Illinois, some other Midwestern states, you know, preaching the word of God. So he was born in 1848 and died in 1921 in Peoria, Illinois. That's it in a nutshell.
Fascinating. Tell us, I know that you found basically descendants of the legal owner. Tell us about that experience.
Finding the descendants of Thomas Hinton. Yeah, that was quite an experience that I shared with my sister, actually. The documents I researched, one of the documents had the address of the owner. It basically said he lived, that the farm was located at the crossroads of Frankfurt Road and some other street I don't remember right now. So one day, this was back in, you know, in 1999, January, so 1999, I went on the internet and I Googled Hinton, Henton, Versailles, Kentucky, and up popped two Hintons who lived on Frankfurt Road. So I found that very interesting. So my sister and I carefully crafted a letter to these two Hintons, telling them that my research had led them to possibly being descended from the person who owned my ancestors. And I put some other information in the letter that let them know what some of this research had revealed. And I said, I hope you have some information that might help me with my research, and I look forward to getting in touch with you later. Well, before I called them, because I did have a phone number, I got a call from Hampton Hinton. And it was this most wonderful thing. We talked on the phone. That was a Saturday morning in, I forgot what, it was in March of 1999. He invited me and my sister to come visit them in Kentucky, which we did in May. 2 months later, we went there to do some research. And while we were there, we went to visit. They hosted us. They live in the same house, on the same land where my ancestors were enslaved. They farm the land still, all kinds of crops, soy and tobacco and cows and whatever, welcomed us with open hands, open arms, not open, well, hands and arms actually, which was just absolutely wonderful. There's no blood that we share, it's no DNA that's shared, but we call each other cousins. We have since had 4 of our last 10 reunions there on the farm, and other family members have come and joined us there. I don't know. So it's been a great experience. If I want, would you like to see a picture? Want me to go back and screen share? Or do you have any other questions? I could answer those first.
Sure, I think we have time to see the picture.
Oh, okay. Let me see here. Okay. Uh-oh. I gotta do something else first, right? Oh, what's going on? Oh, there's a picture of Amanda. This was Frank's wife. She was enslaved also. Okay, these are the Hintons. This is the couple this is Hoppy. He's like the great grandson of Thomas Hinton. And this is Hoppy's father and mother. They've both passed now. They're no longer with us, but they took us on a tour of the area. We went to a bourbon factory, and here's a picture of the house. Like I told you, it was the house that was there back in slave days. This is the front. This is a great big long road lined by apple trees that leads you to the house. And the house has been added on to. There's some new wings there now. I mentioned cows and corn, and well, there's some tobacco. There's a smokehouse. It's like 400 acres. I think it's still 400. Started out as 1,000 acres, but they've sold off some of the land. There's Thomas Hinton's grave marker. Oh yes, and this is a former slave cabin, which is now a guest house. And my sister actually slept there on our second visit to the farm. We stayed there at the house. And my sister, well, she had more nerve than I did. I couldn't quite bring myself to sleep in there, but she did, and found it was a wonderful experience. I got to sleep in the big house. So, and that's it's very, very moving experience. It's a wonderful experience. They've been very nice to us, and we stay in touch. Appreciate that. In fact, our last reunion, which was in July of 2019, was held on the farm. Had a big turnout for that. And yeah, oh, in fact, there we are, all in front of the picture that was taken there in front of the house. And there's Frederick Douglass. This is the man who reenacts Frederick Douglass. In fact, he's been to our museum several times. And there I am. Right.
Okay, so just clarify, Frank was your great grandfather or great great grandfather?
My great grandfather.
Okay, so I have a question from Pete in the chat box, and he says, excellent presentation. Any research on how the Garrett name and line originated? Have you considered writing an article for publication?
Okay, first of all, I have no idea where the Garrett name came from. I really don't. I've tried to find out. We've looked at wills and even met with a Garrett family that lives in Versailles, thinking that maybe they know about a Henry Garrett, but they didn't have any mentions of his name in any of their documents that they had. So no, but I keep hoping that I will run across it somewhere in my research. And yeah, I think about publishing something, but I've never taken the time to do anything. I've got to, at some point, sit down and focus on doing that. Thank you.
Okay, and you mentioned in your presentation that Garrett came from your Frank's father. Have you researched? Did you find any information on who his father was, or is that unknown right now?
Yeah, Frank's father was Henry Garrett. Like I say, I just really haven't found anything about him. I don't know. You know, well, one thing we have to consider too, he may have been free. He could very well have been a free man.
Mhm.
Gives you an example of how little I know about him. Um, so if he would have been free, there are a lot of Henry Garretts listed among in the earlier censuses, you know, 1860, 1850, and 40 and all. But I don't know if he's the Henry Garrett we're looking for. If anybody's got any suggestions for me, or maybe can find my Henry Garrett, I would love that. That would be great. So I don't know, Don. Mhm.
Okay, so I think I have time for one more question. Just to finish everything up, what advice would you give to anyone who wants to trace their roots back to that time period?
Oh, or trace their roots at all. Well, first of all, I tell them it's quite a journey. It's an enjoyable journey. It's something that you have to have a lot of patience for. And but once you get started, you'll find it very hard to put down. For me, and probably others might find this too, tracing my roots has just enhanced my life just so greatly. First of all, when it comes to history, back in school days, I hated history. I mean, I really did. It was something that I just crammed for like the night before an exam, because history was just numbers and dates and names of wars and names of people. And I just never really enjoyed it. But in tracing my roots and seeing how my own people fit into history, it's made it a lot more interesting for me. And you would find the same thing would happen as you trace your roots, whether it's Civil War or Vietnam or any other kind of period of time. Tracing my roots has brought me in touch with relatives that I didn't even know existed. I knew only a handful of relatives on my father's side of the family, but I decided after researching all of these people who had been dead for 100 years that I wanted to get to know my current day relatives. So I called the ones that I knew, and they gave me names and phone numbers and contact information for other relatives. And the number just spread bigger and bigger and bigger, to the point when in 2003, I called together everybody and we had our first gathering, I call it, of the descendants of Frank and Amanda, because I wanted to share with them what I had learned about our shared family history. And they didn't know anything about it. They really didn't know about Frank. They didn't know about the Civil War. They didn't know about the Hinton farm, because we did actually meet there for that particular reunion. So those two things, those three things, what else might I think about? Well, just really expanded my world in general, tracing my roots. After all, it brought me to the African American Civil War Museum. Didn't know about you for a whole year after you existed. And now, where am I? The chairman of the board of directors. So
That's a journey. Have you connected with descendants of Frank's brothers?
Oh, that's another good question. Yeah, I have. That's interesting. Um, yeah, I told you about the descendants, mostly about Frank, the Hinton part of this this family. Um, for the longest time, it wasn't until 2 years ago, to make a long story short, that I was able to find any descendants of the Garrett brothers. You remember there were four of them who took the name Garrett. Henry Garrett had like 13 children, some big number like that. So I figured that there's gotta be a descendant somewhere of those 13 children. And it took me like 20 years for me to finally find them. And it came up on Ancestry one day. And as I looked further and found an obituary, sure enough, there were names in the obituary that I already had on my Ancestry family tree. Long story short, I got in touch with one of them, and the last reunion we had in 2019 that I showed you a picture of, it was the Hinton Garrett family reunion. So yes, I have found some descendants of the Garretts. It's been great.
That's fine. I had one more question and it just flew away. I wanted to know about the property. Someone in the chat asked about if there were marked graves of any enslaved people on the property.
Okay, I didn't really hear your question. They wanted to know what?
If there were any marked graves of enslaved people on the property.
Okay, not that I would say no, there are no marked graves, but I remember asking Hoppy Hinton whether or not he knew if there were any buried on the land, and he said that they don't know. So
Okay.
it's not, yeah.
Yeah,
There are no marked graves, to answer the question.
interesting research project there.
Yeah, older.
So again, thank you so much for taking the time out on your Saturday is to present for us. I know I found your story fascinating. I've heard bits and pieces of it working for the museum, but this is the first time I feel like I've sat down and not actually had like a whole bunch of distractions from in-person events to actually listen to the full story. So it was very informative for me. For anyone else who is on the call with us. If you are interested in presenting, you can always reach out to me. Dawn Chitty is DAWNCHITTY at afroamcivilwar.org. And I can help you get started with doing your own presentation. This one, of course, has been recorded and will be available, shared on Facebook pretty soon within the next couple of days. Rather. So if you have any questions, feel free to drop me an email as well. And of course, thank you, Audrey, for doing this for us.
Thank you. Thank you for asking me to do it. And I'd like to thank everybody for being there. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you.
Okay. Bye-bye.